Today on the bench, I have a Matco MT2120 3/8 drive air impact. Customer said that he had it looked at by Matco, and when he got it back, it had the same problem. It says it lacks power. So I told him I'll take a look at it, free of charge, and if I find something, I'll let him know. If not, I'll hand it back to him. But I figured it's just a good chance to get some video content and get some experience pulling apart these tools, and if I find something great, if not, he's no worse off than he was before, and he'll take it back to his Matco guy. But he was kind of disappointed in I guess, the service he was getting, so that's why he mentioned it to me. So I said, hey, look, no obligation to you whatsoever. I'll take a look at it, tell you what I find. So that's why we've got it on the bench. These things, I believe, are made by Ingersoll Rand or AirCat or one of the two, but they're very similar in how they're built. There's 4 body screws in the back. You pull these out and it releases the hammer housing here from the rotor housing. You have your hammer assembly up front and then your rotor housing in back. The rotor is held in place by a plate on the back, and this selector switch engages with the rear of the rotor housing to select the speed. So first things first is to get those 4 body screws out, and then we separate the whole thing and see what we got. These are a T15 torque screw. Now that the screws are out, we can separate the hammer assembly and the housing from the rotor assembly and the housing. Keep this on a horizontal surface because you have this on end and you pull this out, everything's going to fall out. Or if you have it like this way, you pull it up and the rotor will fall out. So keep it horizontal and just pull them apart. Sometimes this assembly comes out in the housing. In this case, the housing just came up by itself. And we're going to give a quick inspection to everything that we see to see if we see any damage or anything that looks prematurely worn. The inside face of the housing looks good. It has a buildup of old lubricant, that's expected, but there doesn't seem to be any damage to it. Sometimes if something's been loose or broken or flopping around in there, it'll damage the inside of the hammer housing. That is not the case, that looks good. The hammer assembly consists of the anvil, the 2 hammers, the hammer cage, and 2 hammer cage pins that keep the assembly in there. And they're just sets on a spline drive on the front of the rotor. This just pulls straight off. When you have it off, you remove this pin and that pin by pushing them out, and then the entire assembly comes apart. I just use a pocket screwdriver to push the pins out. Lay this flat in my hand, take the anvil out. By twisting it a few times and pulling, that comes straight out. And then let's lift the hammer cage off the 2 hammers. There you go. And inspect the inside of the hammer cage. Looks good. Inspecting the hammers. They look good. And the pins look good. Be careful when you take the gaskets off. Note the way they come off so you can put them back properly. There is a right way and a wrong way. There is a top side and a bottom side, and an upside down, and a right side up and upside down. On these, look at the hammer housing. There's a notch there. That notch fits this tab on the gasket. So when you put it all back together again, it has to set together like that, where the notch on the gasket goes in the slot on the front of the hammer housing. The rotor housing consists of this faceplate. Inset and pressed into the faceplate is a bearing, and the spline drive portion of the rotor sticks out through the bearing, and that's what it spins around. This whole assembly should drop out. You might have to push on the selector switch to get the whole thing to go through the housing. And then the selector switch pulls off. Sometimes it needs a little persuasion, just a little pocket screwdriver action. We'll get that to pull the rest of the way off. On the rear of the housing is where the rotor sticks through the back around a bearing. It's hard to see, but there is a snap ring that goes around this spindle on the rotor to hold it in. The plastic faceplate just pulls off. In a perfect world. Here it's a little tight. While I'm working on getting the plate off, one thing I did notice is this old lubricant is all over the place, and that's not unexpected. But it feels very gritty. So I suspect that it's particularly old, that it has burned over time, and if someone did have this apart before, they didn't do jack squat to clean it up. So I'm a little disappointed if someone charged the customer to do any work on this prior, because if they did, they neglected to clean it and re-lubricate it. So I don't know what somebody would have said they've done, but if the old burned gritty lubricant is any indication on the outside of the housing, it might be old gritty burned lubricant on the inside where the rotor is, and that is going to rob this thing of all its power. So once we get in there somehow, we'll take a look, but I'm already not happy with whatever level of service the customer received previously by somebody else. And you have to be careful separating this plate here, because it's made out of plastic, and I don't want to crack it, deform it, or take a chunk out of it. So because it usually just pulls off, given how difficult it is to get this off, I doubt anyone even disassembled this unit before. That's what really ticks me off. Clearly, somebody did not do any work to this, especially when you look inside the hammer housing like we did earlier. It's all full of lubricant. I don't think anyone did anything to this. Because what I suspect is, assuming there's nothing broken, and aside from some wear, it might just need a good cleaning and re-lubrication, and then it'll be 100%. I've seen that before, where stuff's just neglected over the years, and the good going over makes it like new again. Just need a little tapping from a hammer just to get that out. That should just fall out. So I'm concerned. So we're going to check this bearing here and see if it's spinning freely while I drop it all over the place. Oh. And lucky for us, the bearing fell out when I dropped it, which is good, because getting these things out, if they're pressed solid in there, is very difficult. But the bearing feels good, so I'm happy about that. Now we're going to remove the snap ring in the back here, and that'll pull the rotor out. We can inspect the face of the rotor. And be careful. This is a tiny little part. Make sure you know where you're putting it. And with the snap ring out of there, the rotor just pulls out of the housing. And what I suspected seems to be true. That's a lot of old dried up lubricant. Try to get it to focus for you. I mean, that's just, it's all sludgy. It's very thick. I wouldn't expect this to work well at all, given that. But at initial inspection, the surfaces look good. But what we're going to do is we'll put this through the parts washer, give it a closer inspection and see. And sometimes too, these veins here, you can see that there's 7 of them. The surfaces of these veins sometimes get worn over time. So we'll check those out and inspect them. And these just pull out. So make sure that they just don't drop out and fall all over the place. And yeah, they go in a certain way. That notch there, right there, that goes toward the rear. And the contoured bottom part goes in the slot first. So we'll take all the veins out, and then we'll send this whole thing through the parts washer. I'm not going to remove this bearing because it's a press fit bearing and it's difficult to get out. If you were to have to remove it, you'd want to apply some heat to the rotor housing and then work this out probably by getting a pick down in there, a little 90-degree pick, and trying to hook out the bearing by working that pick around the surface that mates with the rotor housing. Not easy to do. Unless you have to, I recommend just leaving it in there, which is what I'm going to do because it feels like it works just fine. After getting everything nice and clean on the parts washer, it's time for reassembly, which is fairly straightforward on these units. We'll start by putting the rotor assembly back together. So we need the rotor housing, the rotor, the selector switch, the front plate, the front bearing, and the 7 rotor vanes. We're also going to do some lubrication, so we're going to use some oil. Oh, and I forgot. The tiny little snap ring that you really want to be careful about not losing. This little guy will get caught in rags and stuck to things, and it's very easy to lose track of. Make sure you don't lose it. When you put it down, put on a light background so it doesn't get lost. I mean, it's a sad day if you lose it. You got to get another one. If you don't have them on hand, then you got to go get them, and it's a pain in the neck. The first thing we're going to do in the rotor housing is put some grease on that bearing. It's not a sealed unit like the front one. Other units that I've seen have sealed bearings in the back. This one is open, so we're going to put some grease in there. And get the grease and all the little ball bearings back there. Once that's done, insert the rotor into the housing. Be sure that the spindle on the back with the groove faces towards the rear and goes through the hole and back. And then put your snap ring around the spindle where the groove is. Every time you see the snap ring, be sure it has seated in the groove just by pushing on a little bit and making sure it's where it wants to be. And then if you can spin it around freely without it popping off, you know you hit it right. The problem is if you don't do that and the snap ring pops off once this thing's reassembled and someone's using it, then you just got to take the whole thing back apart again. It's a big pain in the neck. So just be sure that you exercise your ounce of prevention now, and it will prevent the pound of cure later. Next, we're going to put a drop of oil in each slot for the rotor vanes and then drop the vanes in. The best way to do it is to drop them in from the top here where you can see that the rotor is offset in the housing. And the reason is because you need room for the vanes to extend out of the slots so that so it can spin the rotor around. So as a result, you have a larger gap up top than you have on the bottom. So we're just going to insert the vanes in the top slots and then move it a position, drop them in, move it a position, drop it in. And we're going to put a drop of oil in each slot beforehand. I don't like to over lubricate these because too much surface tension from oil on the vanes can prevent them from coming out of their slots. And they have to come out for this to work. I have seen these units that have been over lubricated, and that was the problem, is that the vanes were getting stuck in the slots because of all the surface tension from the lubricant. So we go light on the lubricant on this, and everything should be fine. And when these go in, just make sure you got them right side up. The long flat edge has to glide against the inside of the housing. So when you put them in, just be sure that you have them the right way there. And when they come out, the notch side goes toward the rear. I don't know if that's important or not, but we'll put them back in the way they came out. And just slide right in. And then rotate one position and slide in the next one. Once they're all in there, spin the rotor a little bit. Be sure that you can see the vanes freely moving and popping out of their slots. It gets the lubricant worked in there a bit, and that looks really good. Next is the plate, and we got to put the bearing in there. And putting bearings in is not an easy task because these are press fit bearings. Do not, under any circumstances, pound these in with a punch or some kind of tool along the face of the bearing because you will damage it. It will not work right. Do not do that. I came across that once where somebody gave me his impact and he said it lacked power. There were a lot of problems with it. One of them was the fact that somebody previously took it apart and tried to reassemble it by pounding on this face with a punch, and they wrecked it. So don't do that. If you have to use something, if you can't just press it in, then you can use a socket and gently tap it with a hammer to get it to sit right. You have to be sure that this thing sets in evenly. If you get a little cockeyed, it won't go in. So just be careful, take your time, be patient, and hopefully it just sets right in there without being a pain. And you don't want to push much on this side because this is plastic. You don't want to break it. But you can see how it's almost seated flush. I'll just press it down here, see if I can get it the rest of the way. Yeah. No, popped out. That was weird. No, okay. For some reason, this doesn't fit as tight as other models I know. But that's weird. This is a sealed unit, and I do feel resistance now that I spin it around. Doesn't feel clean. I don't know if that's my... That does not feel smooth to me. It feels like there's some resistance. You can probably, actually, might be able to see it as this spins and gets closer to the end of of spinning. You might see it get caught up. Yeah, it feels a little rough. Like right there, it got kind of hung up. What I'm going to do is, because I'm not going to, I promised the customer I was just going to clean up and evaluate it. I will make a note that that bearing should probably be replaced. Yeah. You can see it stopped kind of abruptly. Yeah. So that's a note for the customer. When the plate goes on the rotor assembly, there is a right way and a wrong way, and I can never remember which one that is. There's a hole in the bottom of the plate, and I believe that matches up with the holes here, but I can't remember. We'll figure that out when we get to the point of having to put this all back together again. Because the one way you're going to know is there's grooves here for the body screws to go through. They'll only fit one way. So if I have it wrong now, all we have to do is just turn it later. The last piece to put on is a selector switch, and the tab here at the top goes in the slots here at the top of the rotor. That's how you know you have it right set up. There's an O-ring around here, so put a little bit of lubricant around that. And this just presses in. The rotor assembly then inserts into the rotor housing. And there's a right side up and an upside down. These two holes need to face down because when the holes go in, they have to meet up with the valve here that dictates the direction of the airflow. So holes here go down here, and this whole thing just slides right in until you have the selector coming out the back, and the rotor assemblies almost flush with the front of the unit. And here's where I check to see if I got the plate lined up correctly, and I did, because the grooves on the plate line up with the grooves in the housing, and now you can see there's a complete hole for the body screws to go through, and there'll be 4 of them. 1, 2, 3, and 4. See them? Now that the rotor assembly is complete, we'll put this aside and do the hammer assembly. We need the hammer housing, the hammer cage, 2 hammers, the anvil, the hammer pins, and the gasket. We're going to lubricate a bunch of parts here. So before we do that, I got my hands all dirty. I'm just going to go through the steps ahead of time. First step is to put the hammers in the hammer cage. The way the hammers go together is important. There's a right side up and an upside down to these, and you can see how it looks like a little ghost with its head in the middle there and his arms sticking up in the air. One has to go with the ghost's arms facing up, and the other goes with the ghost's arms facing down. And these match up like this. They just go over each other. Okay? So when they're together, you get the 2 holes in the middle. So the hammers have to go like that. When we put them back in, they just drop in the cage such that the slots on the sides here and here match up with the holes for the pins, because those are going to slide through and they need the slots for clearance. So we're going to lubricate the inside of the housing and the hammers. And like the rotor, I don't go heavy on lubricant. Ideally, the person owning this should be lubricating the tool on a regular basis. I know they usually don't, but you can see that there is a zerk on the hammer housing so that you can inject it with grease. So I go light on the lubricant, and then I tell my customers, make sure you lubricate it regularly, because I didn't gobble it up with lube. I guess I want them to take that to heart and care for their tools a little bit. And just every now and then inject some grease in there. And then, of course, periodically take everything apart, overhaul it, clean it, or have somebody do it. But it should be done regularly so that you don't wind up with problems like this one had with all the gunk all over it, getting all burned up and crap. All right, so my ghosts are right side up and upside down. And then the hammers just slide in like that. Don't slide them all the way out. Nothing's holding them in. That's what the pins are for. We haven't put the pins in yet. But those have to go in first. And then you slide the pins in to their holes. And you might have to jiggle the hammers around to get the pins to slide through. Usually the first pin goes in real smooth, and then the second one you're going to have to jiggle the hammers a lot to drop that pin through. Like that. The anvil now goes into the hammer assembly, and it just inserts through the hole in the front. Those dogs, which are these pieces here, they have to work their way through the hammers. So when you put this in, you have to jiggle it to get it to sit all the way in. But first, you got to put some grease on it. And you just turn it and jiggle it and wriggle it all around, and then it sets in. And that's as far back as it goes. Take the hammer housing and the hammer assembly that slides in there. There is no upside down or right side up with this. Just insert it. Well, hold on a second. I forgot to lube it up. Put grease on the outside of the hammer housing. And you can go pretty heavy with this. It's an area that probably needs the most lubrication. Now, and then if you don't make that low enough, then it'll push out when it hits the edge of the hammer housing. And then it goes, and the anvil sticks out the end. That's pretty much flush. There's always going to be some grease left over to scoop that out and smear it around in there. And now we got to make the two units with the gasket in between. Now, I think I mentioned it before. If you look at the hammer housing, there is this slot here in the bottom. That slot accommodates this tab on the gasket. So that's how you know you got it lined up correctly. Just set that there, and everybody should line up happy. So take your rotor housing and your hammer housing, and there is a right side up and an upside down to this. The tab on the gasket goes just above the trigger. So if you could have this 180 degrees wrong, and then it won't match up because the screw holes won't match. So to save yourself the frustration of having to do it a bunch of times, just know that where that tab is in the bottom sets just above the trigger. And you're going to have to turn it a little bit and play with it to get the splines to match up. Once they do, this is together. And finally, we take the housing screws, and we're going to put a little bit of Loctite on the end of each, and then we'll just very gently and carefully screw them in. Now, what I do is very slowly just start the screw so that you can line the holes up. Just like that. I don't tighten these down first off. Why? Because you want to make sure that it lines up correctly, and there's a gasket in play here. So the important thing with gaskets is to make sure that you're applying pressure to them evenly. If you tighten down one portion of this first, and it's going to squeeze the gasket, and the other portions that aren't tightened down as much are going to have a gap. So no matter what you're working on in this world, if there's a gasket involved, there's usually a tightening pattern involved and a torque spec. And yes, it's important. Although we're not going by torque spec on this because it's not that critical an application here. We are going to give ourselves a little X pattern to go by. Okay, now that all the screws have been started, they are not yet tightened, but we're just going to go, in a little cross pattern here. And I'm using a tool that has a variable clutch on it, so I can torque down to a different spec. I'm going to start with the lightest setting on here. And you're going to hear it make a funny sound. It's because the clutch is letting off. It's not an impact gun where it keeps hammering. So when you hear it go blap, that means that it's let off and it's not tightening anymore. Like that. Now that we've been through the sequence one time, we're going to repeat it again after turning up the torque a little bit. And then we do it a third time, turning up the torque even more. That's it. Because nothing was damaged, I feel very confident about this working. Normally after a reassembly, I'll run air through it to make sure that it works. It's pretty late at night, so I won't do that now with you on camera, but I'll test it out tomorrow in the morning. But I'm very confident that it went back together. I've taken these apart and put them together a bunch of times. There were no problems with this at all, and because there wasn't any damage, it's not like I have to test to make sure parts are working again. I'm confident in this tool's ability to perform at a high level now, but I did note that rough patch in the bearing, so I'm going to mention that to the customer, and I'll write that up in the work order, and if he wants me to fix it, I'll quote him a price for it. Replacing the bearings are fairly easy. Pop the old out, put the new one in, and you're ready to go. So I'll give this to him on Monday. I'm shooting this video on a Saturday, so I'll give it to him Monday. Have him test it out and see what he says, and hopefully earn some goodwill and some additional business from him, and do for him what the Matco guy couldn't do. And it's sad that you pay full price for this stuff on the tool trucks, you're not getting full service. I was very disappointed when I took this apart to find that it hadn't been serviced before, and they charged him money for it. So I'm going to talk with him, see what he wants to do, if he wants me to get a bearing for him, or maybe he wants to shove this sideways up the Matco guys. I don't know, but I feel good being able to help the guy, and honestly, it works out for both of us. He's going to get the tool evaluated and cleaned up and for free, and I get some content out of it for the YouTube channel. So we're both making out all right. And if he wants me to do some more work, I'm happy to do it for him. So do me a favor and keep watching the channel, because you're going to see some other air tool repair videos, including one for a 3/4 inch Cornwell air impact built by Aircat, and some really cool reviews of the Milwaukee M18 pole saw and their 8-inch hatchet chainsaw. So do me a favor and click down here now to subscribe so that you don't miss any of it. Thank you so much for watching, and remember, use a tool. Don't be one.